Io lascerò indrieto il ragionare delle repubbliche perché altre volte ne ragionai a lungo. So, after the brief outline of his argument in chapter 1, Machiavelli settles down in chapter 2 to flesh out his case. And as he does so, he opens by underlining his distinction in chapter 1, reminding us that the states now under discussion are not republics. These, he says, he's going to leave to one side because he's discussed them elsewhere. Now, past tense of Machiavelli's verb in the second part of his claim has led some scholars to hypothesize about the existence of an earlier text about republics, either perhaps lost or later incorporated into the discourses. Well, those conjectures have been advanced with varying degrees of plausibility. We may just be looking at a later adjustment to the text on the part of Machiavelli. But I'm much more interested in the first part of the assertion, not least because it is simply and rather spectacularly not true at all. Machiavelli continually talks about republics in the following chapters. The whole of chapter 5 is dedicated to the subject of republics, as the title indicates, and so is chapter 8. I mean, it's manifestly no coincidence that Machiavelli's two outstanding examples of how to acquire a principality by utterly wicked means, as he puts it, are both cases of the subversion of functioning republics. In order to realize his desire to become prince and to hold with violence and without any obligation what had formerly been conceded to him by agreement, Agathocles, we're told, conspired with outside forces and convoked the people and Senate of Syracuse as if to discuss matters concerning the Republic before proceeding to massacre his fellow citizens. And in more recent times, Machiavelli tells us that Oliverotto of Fermo had relied on internal forces, overturning a free state with the help of some citizens to whom the servitude of their native city was preferable to its liberty. So both Agathocles and Oliverotto ignore their obligations, engage in acts of considerable deception, and indulge in merciless killing. And as such, they're hardly distinguishable from that exemplar of princely virtù presented in the preceding chapter, Cesare Borgia. Yet in the case of Agathocles and Oliverotto, Machiavelli's moral evaluation completely changes because I think of the historical setting in which their actions occur. They lead a republic from within, from a state of liberty into a state of servitude. This type of activity cannot be called virtù, according to Machiavelli. Machiavelli stringently insists in his political ethics upon a distinction between deeds of wanton wrecking and acts of genuinely creative violence, which, as the examples of Borgia and Romulus show, might help produce and protect the vita civile, civil life of an infant Stato, as he puts it. In the Discorsi, it's the man who uses violence to break things, not to mend them, that is blameworthy. And he's at it again in chapter 9. Here we learn of less violent means by which a private citizen becomes a prince of his own country through the favour of his fellow citizens. Machiavelli explains the phenomenon of the civil principality in terms of the conflict between the two appetites, or humours, in the body of a free city. Here he says there are three possible outcomes, which he identifies as o principato, o libertà, o licenza. Those outcomes then are by definition conditions either of servitude, or of freedom, or of anarchy. So the civil principality occurs when either one of the two groups of citizens favours one of their own as a prince in order to oppose the other, only to secure a situation in which they all end up dominated. So here too citizens collaborate in the production of their own unfreedom. So the opening of chapter 2 is demonstrably a glaring example of irony, of Machiavelli's declaring that he's going to be doing one thing and actually doing quite the reverse. Well, he's already shown us how ironic he can be in his prologue. There, you'll recall, he makes an ostentatious disavowal of any use of rhetorical embellishment in his argument. I have not adorned this work, he says, by filling it with rounded periods, with high-sounding words, or fine phrases, or with any other sort of allurement or external ornament with which many writers customarily describe and adorn their subject matter. But the repetitive use of the language of adornment in this denial is itself a figure of speech. And then Machiavelli plunges us into an extended cartographic and topographic simile, which provides some of the most memorable imagery in the whole text. Well, Machiavelli's a master of various forms of irony, and his skill in handling them suggests once again the influence of Roman rhetorical authorities. When Quintilian discusses irony as a figure of thought, he tells us that he prefers the Latinized form ironia, but concedes that there are authoritative grounds for translating the Greek word as dissimulatio, dissimulation. This is the term that Cicero had used, after all, describing the rhetorical figure of dissimulatio as saying one thing and meaning another. So throughout his work, Machiavelli frequently dissimulates, and in doing so, he is, of course, merely practicing what he preaches. And again, one of the consequences, I think, of seeing the ironic character of his claim in the opening of chapter 2 is that we really do have to put a question mark by all those interpretations which see Machiavelli's theoretical concerns with freedom emerging only when he turns his attention to the question of lo Stato libero, the free state, the republic, in the discourses. Machiavelli's thoughts about freedom and the state are first laid out here. In the later texts, they're then reprised and, of course, elaborated systematically. But our present view of Machiavelli as a theorist of liberties, currently missing an account of an entirely complementary theoretical preoccupation pursued across both works. So Machiavelli is always as interested in the production and maintenance of liberty's antonym, servitude in Machiavelli's Italian servitù, as he is in the state of freedom itself. And nowhere, I think, is this concern more evident than in Il Principe. Indeed, in a very obvious way, the conceptual difference embedded in his theory of stati provides Machiavelli with a nice structure for his intellectual labor. We have 2 books of political philosophy, each work ostensibly dedicated primarily to studying one of the 2 types of states. Yet both texts carefully keep the alternative political body fully in view, and they do so in order to sharpen the distinction between them. In fact, Machiavelli must keep the Republic in our sights during his discussion of principalities in The Prince in order to press his opening definition home. I mean, the very basis of the identity of the principality derives from its differentiation from the Republic on the grounds that it's not free. So as his argument proceeds, Machiavelli increasingly expands upon his initial way of casting the distinction between free and unfree states in chapter 1. So in chapter 3, for example, new subjects formerly under princely rule are said to be non usi a vivere liberi, not used to living free. Those who've previously inhabited republics are contrastingly said in chapter 5 to have belonged to a city used to living free, usi a vivere liberi. This group of people is then said to be accustomed to living according to their own laws and in liberty, consueti. Indeed, Machiavelli dedicates the entire chapter to this kind of state, telling us that these citizens must be considered differently from those who come from city-states and regions used to living under a prince, who is said to not know how to live free. Well, in order to retrieve the concepts of liberty and servitude which Machiavelli is applying in his theory, we need to turn to the text from which his definition of states in chapter 1 draws its bipartite form and its content, the Roman law theory of persons in Justinian's Digest. Its famous opening states that the chief division in the law of persons is that all men are either free or else are slaves. And the difference between free and unfree persons consists in the fact that some persons are in their own power, some are subject to the law of another. So slaves are persons in the power of their masters, we're told, and are said to be subject to the jurisdiction of someone else. They're not sui juris, as we still say, but are subject to the jurisdictional power of a master. So in Roman law, slaves are classifiable as items of property, persons, but also as things which belong to someone else. Well, Machiavelli distinguishes republics from principalities on this understanding of what it means to live in the dominion of another. He simply transposes the bipartite structure of the theory of persons onto his theory of the state in order to predicate liberty and servitude, not of individuals, but of more complex bodies. It's a very simple, but it's a masterful move. And by the time we arrive at the differential, the property of the principality has actually been inserted into the definition. It's very clever. It is, in fact, the property of someone else. So that explains why the principality is not called a repubblica, for Machiavelli makes principe a synonym of signore in his second sentence. But to have a signore or master is just what it means to be unfree on Machiavelli's account. And then we have the division between hereditary and new principalities, which implies a very specific class of things, namely possessions. And Machiavelli goes on to prove this point in detail. Some new states are very easy to hold on to, he says, if they were formerly ruled by a prince, chapter 3, since to possess them securely, it's enough to have extinguished the line of the prince who used to dominate them. If such a state is acquired in a culturally diverse province, one solution, we're told, is for the person who acquires it to go and live there, since this would make that possessione, that possession, more secure, more durable. And contrastingly, in the case of republics, there's no sure way of possessing them, we're told, other than by destroying them. So republics cannot be possessed by masters. The new prince must undo them, or else expect to be undone by them. It's of course true that chapter 6 and chapter 7, perhaps chapter 9 too, as well as the closing exhortation of the prince, all open up important theoretical possibilities, occasions in which a virtuoso prince might form or even reform a state in such a way that leads it towards its freedom. But it is noticeable that the development of those arguments is entirely deferred, and conspicuously so, to the discourses, to the later text. Machiavelli's instructions to the prince are on how to create and maintain the state, to keep it in his hands. And that means keeping it in the state that it's in. And that is a state of unfreedom. And that this is the underlying point of Machiavelli's argument is made abundantly clear in the prologue. Here Machiavelli tells us what his work is about when he declares to his audience, in startlingly direct, if drivingly ironic terms, that he's offering his small volume to his prince as testimone della servitù mia, a token of my devotion, perhaps, as this phrase has been rendered in English translation, but also, of course, proof of my servitude. So of all the species of irony which Machiavelli's mastered from his Roman rhetorical authorities, his deployment of this particular variety, in which he uses irony as a trope, so that what is actually said, as Quintilian explains, may very well be literally true in another context, is perhaps the most striking of all.